Well, hello, and welcome to this module of the United Church of Canada Doctrine course. This lecture functions as sort of a wrap-up and an invitation. It's a wrap-up because our time together studying United Church doctrine has just about run out. And it's an invitation to you that I hope you'll take up to continue to engage with theology and doctrine in disciplined ways throughout your ministry. After more than 36 years in congregations and the courts of the church at every level, I'm more convinced than ever about the importance, the necessity, the benefits of clarity about theology and doctrine as we face the challenges of faithfully walking into the future with God. And I hope I say that not just because I'm a stuffy old white guy who likes his power and privilege. But at the basis of so many of our differences about what the church is and should be and should do, including those that rise to the level of conflict and fighting, at the root of those is often a misunderstanding about the foundations from which we are operating, or, and this happens more frequently than we sometimes acknowledge, a failure to recognize what we hold in common, but we are expressing differently. Let me try an example and see if this makes sense to you. It's familiar in church life, at least it has been for me, music and hymnody. Now, in lots of congregations, music and hymnody become a flashpoint of often very real and painful conflict. And often, by the time cooler heads prevail, differing parties have withdrawn into their corners, snarling and spitting at one another. Too often, somebody's job may have been lost, and feelings have been hurt. If we could have a conversation, what might that look like? Well, first, can we agree that music is important in church? And generally, the answer is yes. That's why we're having this fight anyway. Next, can you name some of your favorite hymns and why? And not surprisingly, we often generate very different lists, but we are getting somewhere. We've moved beyond I like it to, and I don't like it to talking about specific cases. Especially the why question is important to us. We can talk about why things are important to us. We are now talking about the same things, even though those important things are manifested differently for us. Sometimes those differences will have to do with the quality of the music, the way it makes me feel, my connections, positive or negative, in my memories with certain styles of music or even specific songs. Occasionally, someone will talk about the words or the meaning in the hymns. Do you see what has happened? We have moved from like and don't like, which is intensely personal, and shaped the encounter in conflictual ways, to categories of discussion that are out there. They're on the table between us. We can talk about them. We can move perhaps towards greater mutual understanding and even ways to thrive together in worship. So that's a very, very abbreviated example that is intended to demonstrate the place of theology and doctrine in some of our most intense conversations that arise, at least in part, because of our plural identity. The aim of such conversation needs to be understanding the other. Because if we enter a conversation with the first intention of proving the other side wrong, then we have violated the intention and purpose of dialogue. Now, our readings for this module are a selection from many of efforts to try and step back from day-to-day issues and name some of the opportunities and challenges before our United Church. Our job, yours and mine, is to ponder those theologically. Phyllis Earhart encourages us to recapture the founding vision, albeit in a different frame. There was an attitude, some might even call it an arrogance, in the founders of our church that led to the enunciation of an ecclesiology that was supposedly fitting for everyone. 9 decades on, we can recognize some of the weaknesses in a viewpoint that privileged a particular perspective. Canadian society is simply more pluralistic than it was, both within and outside the Christian community. And so the question that I put to you for your reflection is, from a doctrinal and theological perspective, is pluralism good? Is it a bad thing? Or is it simply a neutral reality with which we need to deal? That will have a fundamental impact on how we live out the second part of the founding vision, service to the nation. I happen to agree with Erhard. Despite some notable lapses and some horrific failures, the United Church of Canada's record of service to the nation in the name of Christ is admirable. And that is part of doctrine of the church and of our Christian calling. The church, at least as we conceive of it, does not serve out of self-interest or because we're just good folks. It serves out of a conviction that at its very core, that's why Christ calls us into being. The question today is often, can we serve without being in control, without getting credit, gaining members, and so on? Which may come back to pluralism. How important is it that we believe the same things in order to share a response to an issue that threatens us all? From Erhard again. She cautions us about moving towards theological positions and denominational policies that feel alien to us. And I would add, of course, we need to ask, why do these feel alien? Our doctrines of sinfulness and regeneration remind us of how easily we can fall prey to things which keep us comfortable, while at the same time they are unjust and they misaligned with our faith. However, if we have done the hard work of looking beyond our feelings to our reasons, then we may need to trust our guts. If it feels wrong, it may well be wrong. There is in our church a fundamentalism of both the left and the right. And there are times when each has been in the ascendancy in our shared life. Our founders sought to create a Christian community that could accommodate both and everyone in between. If we look south of the border, for example, it has been far more common to divide the traditions rather than trying to accommodate differences. And so we see the repeated divisions of Christian families. In Canada, the pattern, not just in the United Church, but more broadly, the pattern has been to work at holding tensions together. It's also commonplace for everyone who feels that they are a measure of distance from the center, whatever the center might be, to feel under siege. I have heard it from folks on the theological left and the theological right. I felt it from time to time myself, but it were ever thus. Some of the readings you've done this term, and those of you who did United Church history have done even more of those readings, will recognize that what seems like a common and uniform message out of a particular era usually was anything but. And I'm not sure that our pluralistic tensions are greater now than they were in 1925. They may well be, especially if they bring into play the spiritual wisdom and journeys of those who often have been marginalized. But if Erhard is correct, and I hunch that she is, the desire to draw people together for the service of Christ in God's world may be an important factor in our response in this era. In the late 19th century, the founders of what would become the United Church of Canada were responding to a hunger for a common faith that would overcome the divisions that had been imported from Europe and which no longer seemed relevant. Today as well, there is a desire for something more than the producer-consumer binary view of life into which our culture is determined to lock us. We find many people searching. And both our doctrinal statements and our faith statements call us to the position of presenting Christ to those who are searching. In the words of the Creed, we are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, and to proclaim Jesus, crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. Or, in the words of the Song of Faith, the fullness of life includes moments of unexpected inspiration and courage lived out, experiences of beauty, truth, goodness, blessings of seeds and harvest, friendship and family, intellect and sexuality, the reconciliations of people through justice and communities living in righteousness, and the articulation of meaning. And so we sing of God the Spirit, who from the beginning has swept over the face of creation, animating all energy and matter, and moving in the human heart. Earhart also calls us to a more radical inclusivity, rooted more deeply in the center of our faith, drawing people into a wider conversation about the kinds of lives we want to make. In this, I hear an invitation to focus on what genuinely matters, as opposed to that which is merely comfortable or conventional. Which leads me to her last observation, where she invites us to recall the aspect of the founding vision, calling a church into being for the sake of Canada. John Calvin, the Swiss Protestant reformer whose work led to the Presbyterian and Reformed traditions of which our United Church is a part, spoke of the church gathered out of the world for the sake of the world. In other words, our ecclesiology does not, as some ecclesiologies do, give us a warrant for a gathered community that stands apart from the world. This is what we see in radical Anabaptist communities such as Mennonites and Hutterites and Old Order Amish. No, in our doctrines and traditions, God claims a people for Christ in order that, by the power of the Spirit, the holy work of justice-making and reconciliation might go forward. That was part of the founding impetus for our church. Earhart suggests that a faithful future might be found in its recovery, but as our 1940 statement urges, in the language and practice of our generation. We have a second group of readings which direct our attention to the United Church commitment to become an intercultural church. Our readings endeavor to make clear what that phrase intercultural means, and I confess that as a pastor in a congregation, this has remained for me a powerful but elusive goal. I've never quite been able to figure out how we create an atmosphere that is interculturally welcoming, but does not somehow pander and play at something we're not, if the folk who we are seeking to welcome are not already in our midst. In a sense, it's a chicken and an egg. For instance, in my part of the country, the most likely intercultural connections are going to be with African Nova Scotians, but it could be with any group. But to be interculturally welcoming, we need someone to help us grow into what that looks like, but without them being welcomed, how are they going to be there? Do you see the conundrum that I am in? And in terms of this course, I have been wondering what an intercultural church might ask of us theologically and doctrinally. Now, before you automatically recoil in disgust at the notion, you might want to listen, if you haven't, to the words of my friend, the Reverend Paul Walfall, at the General Council meeting last summer, and you can see the link there in the title bar. In my ears, what Paul said to us rings as something more than it's a call for belonging. It's an invitation to look again at some of our doctrinal assertions. And my thought here is not that they are necessarily untrue or in error, but rather, are they complete? Is there a fuller aspect of God's truth revealed in the faces that look different from mine and who speak in accents different than my own? I don't know, but my hunch is that the emphasis on becoming an intercultural church is going to take more than simply choosing different hymns on a Sunday morning. As Earhart suggests in Recovering the Founding Vision in this new millennium, the United Church came into being to take a place in the public square, to participate in public debate, to get involved in the hard choices where church doctrine rubs up against things like politics, racism, prejudice, and the like. The seemingly intractable issue of Palestine and Israel is one such place. Why would we want to care? Well, here's a list of reasons. The land of Israel-Palestine has a unique place in the story of our faith. There are Palestinian Christians who are calling out for our aid as siblings in Christ, as well as Jews in both Canada and Israel who seek allies to draw Israel in a different direction than the one she's currently following. As the church carries much of the conscience of the nation, we have concern both for the anti-Semitism of which we have been a part in the past and which seems to be on the rise in our midst again. Believing that God's Spirit calls and propels us into places of injustice, we recognize the injustice of that long conflict, injustices perpetrated on both sides, which, by the way, is not a statement of equivalent blame. It is simply a recognition that neither side in the conflict is without guilt. We hear the gospel call to take the side of the marginalized and the victimized, and we cannot help but see the power and force differentials. From our own history, we recognize the echoes of what occurs when one side seizes the land and resources of the traditional inhabitants. As Christians, we also recognize that there are parts of the Christian family who support Israel for their own reasons, believing that a reunited Israel, complete from the river to the sea, is a necessary component for a part of Scripture that they read as predicative of the future. As citizens in the world, we can also take cognizance of the number of references to international law and our government's own policies, not that they would control our response, but that doctrinally speaking, we recognize that governments, political and social structures have a part in extending the justice and love of which Christ speaks, although that is not done in specifically Christian intention. For me, at any rate, that includes the right of existence for the state of Israel, which the United Church supports, but not at the cost of oppressing their neighbors. As North Americans, in so many ways, so much more affluent and powerful, yes, even as clergy and MDiv students, than so much of the world, we recognize that part of the power imbalance arises because fellow citizens of ours are flooding money and arms to one side, even as some in other parts of the world do the same for the other. Meanwhile, non-combatants are caught in the crossfire of seemingly intractable violence. We continue within the next section.